Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. It can sometimes be easy to forget the truly global nature of the Cold War. From Norway to Argentina, not a single political entity escaped the attention of the superpowers as they struggled for dominance between 1945 and 1991. An often overlooked theater of the Cold War is the continent of Africa, whose fate hung in the balance after over a century of European dominance. In this video, we'll focus on the impact of US and Soviet political, economic, and military interventions in Africa, and how they affected the process of decolonization. We'll also see how the Europeans reacted to the various nationalist and socialist movements that emerged during this period, and how the stubbornness of some colonial powers resulted in some of the most brutal conflicts in history. It is important to note that this is not an exhaustive analysis of the topic, as there is only so much we can cover in a single video. Before we continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends, the first game to bring the true console-level experience to your phone. Explore millions of champion combinations and master countless tactics as you take on raid bosses, dungeon runs, campaign battles, and PvP arena matches. With hundreds of artifacts to equip and over 600 champions with unique skills, you can build your team, develop your champions, and raid your way. 3 of my top favorite things about Raid are the high attention to detail and expressive animations, the sheer amount of varied content including dungeons, the arena, and the main storyline, and the high level of customization available to your teams, from weapon upgrades to hero matching. Raid's exciting schedule of events and activities this month include Forge Pass Season 3, as well as amazing rewards, such as a limited edition artifact set, new champions, and stunning champion skins for the incredible Madame Ceres. More importantly, later this month, Raid is giving fan-favorite champion Death Knight a long-awaited and well-deserved upgrade to Legendary Champion. Now is the best time to get started with Raid. For the next 30 days, new players who click my link in the description below or scan the QR code on screen get the equivalent of $30 in unique bonuses, including Tyrell, a free epic champion, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so you can summon champions as soon as you get in-game. All this treasure will be waiting for you here when you log in. The Second World War was instrumental in breaking the stranglehold of colonialism in Africa. After 6 years of conflict, the British Empire was an exhausted shadow of its former self, while the French Republic was left in deep political and social turmoil after the Nazi occupation. With the great colonial powers now at their weakest, the Africans quickly realized the importance of currying favor with the United States and the Soviet Union, whose influence could easily determine the success or failure of any independence movement. Though neither of these superpowers had a direct say in African affairs, they could exert considerable influence via the United Nations, which they had jointly founded alongside 50 other member states in June of 1945. The first major example of UN interference in Africa occurred when the fate of the former colonies of the defeated Italian Empire was called into question. Italian territories in Libya, Somaliland, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the rest of East Africa had been placed under Allied military administration after the end of the war, and many expected that at least some of these lands would be divided up between Britain and France in the coming years. But in 1949, the UN General Assembly endorsed Libyan independence, resulting in the creation of the United Kingdom of Libya 2 years later. The British had recognized the full sovereignty of Ethiopia in 1944, and Emperor Haile Selassie returned to power once the Italians were driven out of the country. Eritrea would then become part of the Ethiopian Empire in 1952, while Somaliland and East Africa were put under their own paths to self-governance by UN oversight committees. Unfortunately, a majority of these mergers or integrations would merely set the stage for the divided, poverty-stricken Africa that trudged into the 21st century. While the UN was quietly limbering up in preparation for full-scale decolonization, France was busy providing a case study on how not to hold on to colonial territories. After becoming completely bogged down in the First Indochina War with Vietnam, the Republic then received another massive blow from an explosive rebellion in 1952 in Algeria, one of France's oldest colonial territories. The rebels were known as the National Liberation Front, whose leaders were highly active in the international community, denouncing French treatment of the native Muslim population and selectively courting the favor of both the Soviet Union and the United States for their own ends. The uprising coincided with unrest in the French holdings of Tunisia and Morocco, forcing the Republic to grant both independence in 1956 so that resources could be diverted to Algeria. Throughout the 7-year conflict, both sides committed blatant atrocities, murdering civilians, assassinating prominent officials, and making liberal use of torture. By 1958, most of the international community had turned against the French administration, and in an effort to hold on to the jewel of their colonial empire, the military orchestrated what amounted to a coup by demanding Charles de Gaulle become the next French president. With little bargaining power, the French parliament agreed, and de Gaulle immediately set about solidifying his hold on Algeria by holding a referendum on Algerian independence. Completely distraught at this perceived betrayal, several generals controlling paratrooper divisions in Algeria and the French Foreign Legion attempted another coup, only for the effort to collapse thanks to a lack of general army support. Algeria would gain its sovereignty in 1962, prompting more than 1 million French Algerians, Jews, and Muslim Algerians who served in the French army to flee to France. The 1950s also played host to the Suez Canal crisis, which would highlight to the entire world that the former colonial powers were now playing second fiddle to the United States and Soviet Union. In 1952, Egypt's pro-British Muhammad Ali dynasty had been overthrown in a coup orchestrated by army officers Mohammed Naguib and Jamal Abdel Nasser. By 1954, Nasser had become president of the new Arab Republic of Egypt and was a strong proponent of Pan-Arabism and Arab socialism, as well as an open supporter of the Algerian independence movement. Having spent most of his early reign antagonizing both Britain and France, Nasser went one step further on the 26th of July 1956 when he nationalized the Suez Canal Company. When the Egyptians went so far as to ban Israeli shipping through the canal, Britain, France, and Israel formed a military coalition to invade Egypt, depose Nasser, and restore the status quo. But the three powers made a critical mistake right at the outset by failing to consult with either of these superpowers before launching their invasion. And when Nasser began sinking ships in the canal to try and render it useless, both superpowers became enraged. President Dwight D. Eisenhower blamed the coalition for escalating the situation without US input, and the Soviets were quite ready to use the threat of nuclear war as a bargaining chip to stop the Israeli advance. Opposed by all sides, the three nations begrudgingly agreed to withdraw. The strong arming of the two oldest and most powerful European nations, combined with Nasser's massive propaganda victory in successfully holding the Suez Canal, came as a huge shock to the international community. Rather than uphold European claims, the United States and the Soviet Union had both pushed for non-interference in African affairs, despite Nasser's continued support of the Algerian NLF. This would embolden the Egyptian regime and cause Pan-Arabism to expand its influence dramatically, contributing greatly to the Arabian nationalist spirit in North Africa. Nasser was also a prominent figure in the Bandung Conference of 1955, which brought the leaders of 6 African and 23 Asian countries together to discuss cooperation in various economic and geopolitical matters. This conference was a defining moment for African engagement in the Cold War. A vital point of discussion at the Bandung Conference was how the various nations involved would deal with these superpowers. The United States refused to send representatives to the conference out of fear of alienating the various NATO powers who still maintained large colonial territories, but Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai attended in person. Although the various nationalist movements throughout Africa had often received communist support, Zhou realized that expansion in Africa would be both a drain on resources and potentially spark war with the colonial powers. Zhou therefore adopted a moderate tone, encouraging the delegates to choose their future without external interference. At the end of the conference, the 29 nations agreed to unilaterally condemn colonialism and work together in future endeavors. The Bandung Conference was a major first step in the eventual creation of the non-aligned movement, representing 55% of the global population. As Africa moved into the 1960s, decolonization was in full swing. Of particular interest were the Belgian territories of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. Having witnessed the French failure to hold on to Algeria, the Belgians decide to decolonize all 3 regions, starting with the Congo in 1960. But the newly elected Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was condemned by the CIA as a communist infiltrator, which led to the West denying him support when the Katanga region rose in rebellion against his attempts to centralize power. Desperate for aid, Lumumba turned to the Soviets, an act which merely led to his own deposal and eventual assassination in 1961. Lumumba's replacement was Joseph Kasavubu, who was much more amenable to Western cooperation than his predecessor, and quickly received UN aid to quell the Katanga rebellion. But just as elections were called, a communist militia group known as the Simbas seized control of Stanleyville and declared a People's Republic of Congo. Just as Kasavubu prepared to deal with this threat, another communist militia known as the Kilwus appeared to wreak more havoc on the citizens of the Congo. By 1964, combined Congolese, Belgium, and US military operations had quelled the insurrections, but the prolonged conflict left the Congo so unstable that a former sergeant called Joseph Mobutu was able to launch a military coup d'etat only a year later. After easily taking control of the government, Mobutu renamed the Congo to Zaire and proceeded to rule as a deeply corrupt autocrat. Mobutu took a hardline anti-communist stance, leading to his regime being propped up by America and the CIA until the end of the Cold War. Another region that experienced communist uprisings was Eritrea, whose people had never been happy with Ethiopian rule and eventually united behind the Eritrean Liberation Front, or ELF, supplied by China. The 700-year-old Ethiopian Empire would come crashing down abruptly in 1974 when a military junta known as the Derg overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie and established a Marxist-Leninist communist state. But despite receiving considerable support from the USSR, the Derg administration was just as hopelessly corrupt as the CIA-backed dictatorships in other parts of Africa. Rebel groups in the late 80s would dismantle it after leading the once proud nation to total economic ruin. Not all of the conflicts in Africa during the 1960s could be clearly defined by Cold War politics. Chief among them was the tangled mess created by the Nigerian Civil War, which began when the Igbo people declared the independent Republic of Biafra after enduring decades of racial persecution. Nigeria was both a former British colony and a major oil exporter during the Suez Crisis, leading to the British government cynically supporting General Yakubu Gowon's military dictatorship while France championed the Igbo cause. The ongoing Sino-Soviet split that began in the mid-1960s also meant that the Chinese sided with Biafra, while the USSR backed Nigeria. The United States, meanwhile, maintained pro-Biafra neutrality, with Richard Nixon declaring Gowon's blockade of food supplies to the Igbo an attempted genocide. The 2.5 years of war would result in a government victory, at the cost of well over 2 million Igbo deaths from famine and at least 60,000 military casualties. On the opposite end of the political spectrum, the Portuguese colony of Angola experienced a period of violent unrest between the 1950s and 1960s thanks to the efforts of several rebel groups funded directly by the capitalist powers. A major figure was Holden Roberto, leader of the Union of the Peoples of Angola, or UPA guerrilla army, and in the direct pay of the United States, despite being notorious for slaughtering thousands of innocent white and black Africans and pillaging any regions that fell under his control. After merging the UPA with the Democratic Party of Angola, Roberto formed a government in exile and an alliance with Zaire. Despite intense pressure from the UN, Portugal continued fighting back against the guerrillas, but as casualties mounted, the war became increasingly unpopular at home, and in 1974, the Carnation Revolution overthrew the Portuguese government and allowed their overseas territories to gain full independence. Naturally, this resulted in yet more violence when the Communist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, took the opportunity to seize power, causing an exodus of the white population. The ensuing Angolan Civil War was yet another proxy conflict between these superpowers, with the MPLA receiving thousands of troops from Cuba and military support from the Soviets. Meanwhile, South Africa and the United States poured money into the various opposition groups throughout the country. The Angolan Civil War was also intricately tied to the South African Border War, fought between apartheid South Africa and Namibia, a former German colony occupied by the South Africans at the end of the First World War. Rather unsurprisingly, the apartheid regime itself was firmly in the anti-communist camp when it came to Cold War politics, making the Southwest African People's Organization that rose against them in Namibia a prime target for Soviet support. The MPLA would also maintain ties with the Namibian independence movement, resulting in South African forces routinely crossing into Angolan territory to conduct reprisals. Having been independent from Britain since 1931, South Africa was easily the strongest power on the continent, going so far as to start its own nuclear program in 1967. As a major exporter of arms and training to pro-Western forces in other parts of the continent, the regime viewed itself as a primary participant in the international struggle to contain communism. Yet despite the government banning communist organizations in 1950, the South African Communist Party would remain a powerful underground force for the entire Cold War, before eventually re-emerging to become part of the new tripartite alliance with the African National Congress and the Congress of South African Trade Unions after the end of apartheid in 1994. Back in Angola, the civil war raged on for 25 years before culminating in the Battle of Quito Quanavali in 1987. This was the largest battle fought on the continent since the Second World War, involving as many as 90,000 soldiers and lasting for over 7 months. By the time it ended, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola had dealt a decisive blow against the communist-backed People's Republic of Angola, leading to peace talks that would finally end the fighting after over 800,000 deaths. Horribly enough, the Angolan Civil War wasn't even the only bloody conflict fought by a former Portuguese colony, as Mozambique had descended into its own civil conflict in 1977. Yet again, the war was fought between communist and anti-communist guerrilla movements and resulted in over 1 million deaths and 5 million displaced refugees. The last part of Africa we have time to discuss today that experienced terrible interracial violence during the Cold War was southern Rhodesia, whose government declared independence from Britain in 1965 in an effort to delay a planned transition of power to the black majority. In response, the Soviet-backed Zimbabwe African People's Union and the Chinese-backed Zimbabwe African National Union launched an armed insurgency. The latter had strong ties to the Mozambique Liberation Front and even operated out of Zambia, while the Rhodesian government would receive military aid from South Africa and Portugal. Many foreign volunteers from countries like Britain and America would also side with Rhodesia, and for a time, they fought a successful campaign against the guerrillas. However, things would change rapidly after the MLF was victorious in their home country, and Soviet-made ground-to-air missiles began finding their way into the hands of insurgents. In an effort to halt the bloodshed, Prime Minister Ian Smith ended white-majority rule and allowed the country to be renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia with a black-majority government. However, neither ZAPU or ZANU were satisfied, forcing Britain to step in and place Rhodesia under administration until free elections could be held. Said elections resulted in ZANU leader Robert Mugabe rising to the presidency in 1980, whereupon he renamed the country Zimbabwe. But this failed to stop the violence, and clashes between ZANU and ZAPU forces would continue until 1987, when the two groups settled their few remaining differences and merged into a single entity. The cost of this struggle would be the lives of around 20,000 civilians and 11,000 military personnel on both sides. By the time the Cold War drew to a close in the early 90s, Africa had played host to several major proxy conflicts. Early on, the Soviet Union and China repeatedly attempted to establish a beachhead on the continent, hoping that a single strong communist regime could influence the newly formed post-colonial states to form a greater socialist union. But as time went on, it became clear that the African people had been far too negatively influenced by colonialism to tolerate direct rule from either superpower. In the north, Arab socialism found fertile ground in Egypt and Libya, leading to the regimes of men like Abd al-Nasser and Muammar al-Gaddafi, the latter of whom later became a huge proponent of Pan-Africanism, alongside other figures like Robert Mugabe. Tragically, the constant meddling of the superpowers in Africa and the sloppy, haphazard nature of colonialism also exacerbated existing tensions between native racial groups, leading to events like the Rwandan genocide of the mid-90s and the subsequent Second Congo War, the deadliest conflict since the Second World War.